It's around 12 noon on the Housatonic Railroad, where we set up at Lakeland Lumber. As the NX10 comes to a stop, then heads engines light ahead of the siding to run around their train and then shove the train east to Lakeland. Once at the west end of the consist, the NX10 shoves the train east to Lakeland, where 2 sandwiches await for the NX10, them being American combo and turkey and cheese. Got American combo and turkey and cheese.
You're all good.
All right.
I should be buying you lunch. We'll knock it by. You got like some meat. Good on the other side. We're gonna
Once at Lakeland, the NX10 shoves past the switch to the cut point, then pulls back ahead of the switch to back one load into Lakeland. Once ahead of the switch, the NX10 shoves the one load into Lakeland. Once secure on the spur, the NX10 heads back out onto the main and ahead of the switch to back onto the rest of its train and then head west to Chippewa. Once ahead of the switch, the NX10 shoves back onto the 2 boxcars that were left on the main. Once tied onto the rest of its train, the NX10 is ready to go west towards Chippewa, after dropping off one boxcar in Lakeland and picking up 2 sandwiches. As the NX10 heads west towards Chippewa, we reposition by the former Newtown Depot at milepost 87. As the NX10 crosses over Churchill Road, passing by the tail track that currently holds stored gondolas, currently waiting to be loaded at the Hollyville transload. From the Newtown Depot, we reposition at Chippewa, where we see 2 more gondolas at the transload site, in the process of being loaded, but currently at a pause, as they wait for 2 more trucks that have not yet arrived.
Outside you're out of service, looking for permission in you're out of service to take care of the lumber customer and then head on out. Yeah, you guys are good. Henry out of service, milepost 84.
While crews loading the gondola wait for the 2 trucks, the NX10 gets permission through the out-of-service track, as they slow to a stop just east of the Chippewa Spur. Once at a stop, the NX10 has engines light ahead of the switch to pick up the outbound cars that will be heading north to Milford to be handed over to the NX12. Once ahead of the switch is realigned, and the NX10 heads back down into Chippewa. Once tied on to the outbound empties, the NX10 heads back west ahead of the switch to tie onto the inbound loads, then spot them in Chippewa. Once ahead of the switch, the NX10 shoves back east to the inbound loads. Once tied on, the NX10 brings the inbound loads along with the empties ahead of the switch, where the loads will be shoved into Chippewa, where the cars will be spotted and unloaded for Chippewa customers. Once ahead of the switch, the NX10 shoves the loads into Chippewa, where the cars will be spotted and prepared to be unloaded for Chippewa customers. Once the loads were spotted and secure, the NX10 heads out of Chippewa and ahead of the spur, where they'll shove the outbound empties for a brief inspection before heading west to Berkshire Junction.
I'll be right back.
With the inspection complete and Nate back in the cab, the NX10 is ready to continue west to Berkshire Junction, heading out of Chippewa with a total of 5 empties. At Berkshire Junction, we are set up at our usual spot on Riverview Drive. As the NX10 descends the grade of the Maybrook line, slowing to a stop prior to performing the flying switch. Once at Berkshire Junction, the NX10 cuts away from the consist and heads onto the Telcon Industrial as Nate aligns the 5 empties onto the main. With the 5 empties secure on the main, the NX10 with the 22 heads back east ahead of the switch to tie back onto the empties and continue to switch around at Berkshire Junction. Once the switch was realigned, the NX10 heads back west onto the empties. Once tied onto the empties, the NX10 continues to shove west on the main to tie onto the one stored Oak Ridge empty and bring it east to the rest that currently sit on the Telcon Industrial. Once tied on, the NX10 brings the one empty back ahead of the switch to tie onto the rest of the empties, then shove west to Oak Ridge. Once ahead of the switch, the NX10 shoves back onto the empties, where they'll move and cut all but 5 on the main, and then head west to Oak Ridge. Once the work at Berkshire Junction and the work at Oak Ridge was completed, we moved to International Drive by Applebee's, where the NX10 approaches as they bring 5 loaded gondolas north out of Oak Ridge. just north of Farmco, we position at our usual spot on the Vale Road, where after working Farmco we see the NX10 continuing north, with 7 empties from Farmco, giving the NX10 a makeup of 5 loads and 12 empties. Junction Road, we position on the western side of the graffitied bridge, as the NX10 struggles to find the sweet spot, as they slip up the grade while the 22 gives it her best. At the Four Corners, we position by the former Brookfield station, as the NX10 rounds the bend of the straightaway and under the Route 25 overpass, as they continue north towards the end of their day in New Milford. As the NX10 continues north to New Milford, that would conclude our day with the NX10. And as always from the Weathered Rails, thanks for watching.